Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. If you've heard the expression that the early bird gets the worm, when it comes to buying properties in Puerto Rico, it is the persistent bird that's going to get the worm, meaning that you're probably going to have to make a lot more phone calls. You're going to have to try a lot harder to find the right property. It's going to take it could take a lot more energy to find the right place here and to get the deal closed than it might take in other places. This is not a criticism of Puerto Rico. I mean, obviously there are cultural differences, a linguistic difference to doing business here on the island, but it's the fact that the island is this big and is a very popular place. And so not only are there local people that live here that are looking to find properties in a limited inventory, but then there are many other folks that want to come down, that they have Puerto Rican family, they want to come back, they want to buy a property before they retire and start renting it out, and then eventually come and retire here. So or lots of different scenarios, but it's a very popular market for being such a small place. And so there's lots of competition out there. And so let's say that you've done all that work, you finally found the right place, you made the offer and got it accepted. This video is all about what you should know about the contract, and really in Puerto Rico it's called the option to purchase agreement, right? That's why when you see a property is opcionada, that means it's optioned, or that it's already under that option contract phase of the purchase. So in this video, I'm going to try to break it down. What do you need to know? What can you do if you're a buyer that'll be in your favor? How to protect your interest, protect your deposit, and all the things that you need to know. And also, what should the contract have on it so that if you're purchasing with financing, that the contract is ready to go and it's not going to create any delays and you can get to that closing table, right? Let's jump in. So a quick disclaimer here at the top is that I am not a real estate attorney. I am a mortgage broker licensed in Puerto Rico. So I help folks, use mortgages to purchase properties here on the island. And so consequently, I see a lot of contracts. And so the advice in this video is based on that experience. But if you have doubts or questions, or you think that there's been, some kind of a breach of a contract or something like that, I'd encourage you to reach out to a licensed a licensed attorney in Puerto Rico. If you need a recommendation, let me know. I'd be happy to provide that. So that's just the context of the advice that I'm going to provide here. So with that said, let's talk about what are the parts of a contract and what should it definitely include, and then we'll get to some advice while we're talking about that. So the first thing that your contract needs to include is like who the parties are. So like the identities of the seller and the buyer, right, with their full name, full legal name. That should match what says on your ID as well, right? So that's one thing. Another thing that it should also, I think that it should include, is that it's always nice when it includes the names and businesses and contact information of if there's real estate agents involved, and what companies they work for and their license numbers and contact info. That's super helpful to have. So as I've mentioned at the top and in lots of other videos, that real estate in Puerto Rico is just a lot less standardized. And so the not having that information in basically every other state where we originate loans, if there's a real estate agent involved in the transaction, their information, their contact information, name, license number is usually or always on those purchase agreement contracts. But in Puerto Rico, sometimes there's agents involved and they're not listed anywhere. And so it would be a good thing is if you're setting up a contract, you're negotiating those things, encourage the agents to put their information on there too, so that loan officers like me or anybody else who's helping with the transaction, it's easy for us to find out, okay, who can I reach out to ask a question from the sell side or any kind of thing. So having the identities of the different parties on there is going to be very important. Another super important piece of information is going to be the description of the property. So at the very top of the contract, it should list the correct physical address of the property. That could be different from the postal address, obviously, but listing the correct physical address of the property is super important, especially in Puerto Rico, where addresses here are still a little bit less standardized. It's going to be really important that it matches whatever is in the CRIM database. Now, a little bit about the CRIM. The CRIM or the CRIM is the property tax entity here on the island. And so every single parcel, every single property on the island is assigned, it's essentially like its own little social security number, but it's called a catastro number. Catastro, which translates to cadaster number, right? It's literally just like the tax ID number for every single parcel. There's a website, and I'll put the link in the description, where you can go, and if you know the catastro number for the property that you're purchasing, you can plug that in and it will tell you the owner's name, at least what's registered in the CRIM, the owner's name, and it'll say the physical address, right? And it'll have some other details too. And so if the address in the CRIM database does not match what's on your contract, that's going to create a delay. At the very least, you're going to need to sign an addendum correcting that, which is just going to be extra work and extra time. So before you sign a contract, just get the correct catastro number, which should also be on the contract, right? The catastro number. Get that number, check the CRIM website, make sure that the address matches perfectly all the way to the zip code, right? And that'll help avoid any kind of delays in the future. The next piece of information that I'd encourage you to put on there is how long is the option period, right? So if you're really confident that you can get this thing closed up really fast, it could be as little as 2 weeks, right? So sometimes we do hard money deals, and those folks are looking to they found an opportunity, they want to get in really fast and close fast, so they only need 2 weeks of an option contract. This is going to be negotiated between you and the seller, because maybe the seller's in a rush, or they don't want to wait for a long period of time, or maybe they're relaxed and that we can take our time while we work and get these things done. But we've seen everything from a 2-week purchase agreement contract to 90-day purchase agreement contracts to 120 days, right? So they can be anything you want, really. And so, but if you're using financing, the recommendation would be at least 45 days. Better if you can get it for 60 days, right? And so that's going to come into play with how long your interest rate gets locked and all those kinds of things. But it's basically how long do you have in order to close that deal and get to the closing table. Another very important piece of information to have on the contract is what's the purchase price? What was the agreed upon price? So when you made that offer, how much was that got accepted? That number needs to be on there. And also if there's an earnest money deposit, which is essentially, as a buyer, that's you giving them a little bit of money on the front end to say, hey, hold on to this. This is how serious I am. Please don't accept any other offers. Meanwhile, we're working to get this closed. So how much will that earnest money deposit be for, and where will it be held? That's a very important detail, right? So you can imagine that if you just give a big old deposit to the seller and they deposit it directly into their account, if there's an issue with title, if there's an issue with insurance, if there's an issue with the financing, that the deal can't proceed, well, even if it says on the contract that you should be able to get that back, if it's sitting in their bank account, the seller's bank account, that could be very hard to get. They could delay getting it back, and I had an issue. Yeah, we don't want it to be sitting, your earnest money deposit to be sitting in the seller's bank account. Better if it can be on the contract that money is sitting in an escrow account. Now, that can be the escrow account of the listing agent. That's most common here in Puerto Rico. It could be another escrow account. If there's no agents involved, you can reach out and get an escrow agent to set up an account for you. There's a fee associated. It's like a couple $100, but they will be in charge of holding on to that money. They're an independent third party. They'll have access. They'll have your contract, so they'll know under what circumstances they should return that money to you as the buyer or not, right? And so having that listed on your contract, on your purchase agreement, is going to be super important, and having the language as clear as possible, because sometimes folks think that just like writing, and it'll be held in escrow. Nice. Whose escrow? Where? How much money? For how long? Under what conditions? So having all those details is going to be really helpful. Also, if you're using financing, what type of financing? Are you using just a conventional loan to purchase it? Are you going to be using a government loan like FHA, USDA, VA loan? Or is it another type of financing? Having that information on the contract is important, because if you were pre-approved, let's say you're pre-approved to use an FHA loan, and then something happens and we're not able to proceed with FHA, nobody can obligate you as a buyer to use a specific loan program. And so, let's say that the deal doesn't go through because you were trying to just use FHA and then it doesn't work. Well, then if it says on the contract that you're using this specific type of financing, if that type of financing doesn't work out, well, then that's that, right? And you won't be able to be obligated to just use some other kind of financing to get the deal done if you don't want to. But that can only happen if on the contract it says the type of loan that you'd be using if you're using financing. Another super important part of the contract is if you can include contingencies and conditions, right? So one of the main contingencies to consider having in there if you're on the buyer side and if you're using financing is an appraisal contingency. This means that basically if, because one of the steps in financing is that the lender is going to choose an appraiser, they're going to send the appraiser out and ask them to give an opinion of value. Now, if you offered a certain amount for how much you want to purchase that property for, let's say $200,000, but then it appraises lower than that value, the bank is not going to lend you up to the purchase price that you agreed upon just because that's what the seller is asking for it. A lender is only going to lend you money up to the value that an appraiser says it's worth, right? So if there's a gap, if there's an appraisal gap, and I have another video that's all about just, if there's an appraisal gap and contingencies, then I'll put the link. But if it comes in with a low appraisal, what's going to happen to your deposit? Do you just, oops, well, appraised low, I'm not going to proceed. The seller gets to keep your deposit. If the contract says not subject to appraisal as is, that means that the seller does not care what it appraises for. They want how much they want for it. And so they don't care what an appraiser says, meaning you as the buyer, if it appraises low, you have to bring that difference in cash additional to closing costs and down payment to get the deal to close. So an appraisal contingency in your contract would mean that if it appraises low, well, then what, right? If it appraises low, do you renegotiate the price so that the seller maybe comes halfway down and you come halfway up? Or, are you going to bring the full cash difference? What happens if there's repairs that are needed? Who's going to pay for those? That all of those things should be in your option to purchase agreement. And then there's also financing contingencies. So what happens to your deposit? What happens in the deal if for some reason the financing isn't able to proceed, right? Like there can be several different things. Perhaps the income wasn't calculated correctly, or some source of income changed, or maybe something can happen and that we're not able to proceed with getting your loan to close. Well, then what, right? If you don't have a financing contingency in there and you're not able to proceed because of some issue with the financing process, well, then you're going to lose your deposit. And so having the financing contingency in that contract if you can get it in there, right, is very advisable. The last contingency that I'd encourage you to put on there, or condition that I'd encourage you to put into your contract, is a title contingency, which is to say, from time to time that we find that there's title issues. Typically, it's like something wasn't registered correctly, that the address doesn't match on the deed like it does in the CRIM, or that the property description has some kind of an issue, something like that. But that can cause a delay, and those types of delays can sometimes be enough to break a deal. If that happens in your case, what's going to happen to your deposit? Because a title issue is really a problem on the seller's side. And if you don't have anything stipulated in that contract, you could risk losing your deposit for an issue on the seller side, which would really obviously suck, right? So we want to avoid that. But if it's not on the contract, you can't enforce it. And so if you can get a title contingency on there too, that if there's any kind of a title issue, that the sellers will act to fix it, or that you'll be able to get your deposit back, or however you want it to go, get it on that contract. A next section is what happens if if somebody defaults on like their side of the agreement, and what will be the remedy, right? So this is really going to be more outside of my comfort zone in terms of giving advice here, but consult with an attorney if you want to, or consult with an experienced real estate agent. But if somebody doesn't fulfill their side of the agreement, the contract should stipulate, okay, if the financing doesn't work out, what happens? If the title has an issue, then what happens? If we're not able to get insurance on the property, then what happens? If the sellers are just delaying and taking forever to provide documents, which can happen, then what happens? If the buyer's taking forever, then what happens? So like, is there any flexibility in the term? Like if we get really close and we're still needing a couple things, and it's like down to the wire at the end of the contract period, is there any option if it needs, for example, if there's repairs that are needed, are we able to extend the contract another 2 weeks or something in order to get those repairs done? These are things that if it's not in the contract, you cannot enforce it. And so having those things in there of what happens if one side or the other isn't complying with the agreement and how do you fix it, definitely have that in there. And lastly, signatures, right? Everybody's got to sign it. So if we don't start the contract period of like how long you have to close, it doesn't start until everyone is signed or executed the contract, right? And so that can take some time working on getting that. It could be done electronically, thankfully. So like the closing has to be done in person, but signing a purchase agreement or an option to purchase agreement in Puerto Rico, that can be done virtually. So even if you have to get back on that plane and it's not signed yet, that's okay. That can be done virtually with DocuSign or some kind of a electronic signature thing. But that's that's when the thing becomes enforceable, is when everybody's signed it. All right, everybody. So that's my advice for what you need to know before you go and sign those contracts. If you are about to sign a contract and you want some help, you want some guidance, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be very happy to help you with that. Because getting that step right, it's the all that work that you put into finding the place. Getting the contract right is going to be really, really important. It's only valid for like a short time period, but boy, is it a really important step. So if you want some guidance, if you need some help, let me know. Be happy to help you with that. But otherwise, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.